which was the second day of Svira. We assume everybody learned Daf Beis. So we're ready to start from Daf Gimel. I believe that copies of pages from the Gemara were sent out by Eli. Probably have it, or everybody has their own shas anyway. So Mesechta Sotah Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, the fourth line from the top of the page. We're going to start. Tanya, we learned in a Braisa. Haya Reb Meir Eimer. Reb Meir used to say, Adam Eiver Aveda B'Seiser. If a person does an Aveda in secret, he thinks that he is safe, nobody sees. But somehow the Eibishter finds a way to publicize and to announce it publicly that this Aveda was committed. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, the Avar Olav Ruach Kin. This person who committed adultery and surely tried to do it in the most secretive way possible. But the Avar Olav Ruach Kin, and the word Va'avar, the word Va'avar is a lashon of announcing. How do we know that the word Va'avar is an expression of announcing? Shenemar, it says in the pasuk, Vayitzav Moshe Vayaviru Kel B'Machne. It says when they were building the Mishkan, and everybody brought their contributions to the Mishkan until the people that were arranging the building of the Mishkan came along and said, we have a surplus, there's too much. So Moshe commanded, and they passed around an announcement in the camp saying nobody should bring any more. We've already completed what we need. So from the pasuk Vayitzav Moshe Vayaviru Kel B'Machne, we see that Vayaviru means an announcement. So Va'avar Olav Ruach Kina means that when a person does Chas V'Shalom and Aveda, the Eibishter finds a way of announcing. Shlakish Amar, Shlakish says, Ein Adam Eiver Aveda Elam Kain Nichnas Beiruach Shtus. A person does an Aveda only if a spirit of Shtus, a spirit of folly or insanity enters him. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Ish ki sista ishtay. Any man whose wife will go astray. The word sista means go astray. But tishta ksiv, in the Sefer Torah there's no nikudus. So the word sista can also be read tishta from the word shaita. So when does a person do an Aveda? Only if a Ruach Shtus, a spirit of Shtus, enters him. Tanad Veda Bishmol. Hamidim Rabbi Shmuel learned in a Braisa. We learned yesterday in Daf Beis that there's a very unique halacha by a Sotah. Generally, b'chol HaTorah kula, throughout the Torah, we only believe two witnesses. One witness is very rarely believed for any practical purposes. But by Sotah, there is an exception. And in a case where the husband warned his wife, don't seclude yourself with this man, and she violated the warning, and she secluded herself with this man, which under normal conditions, we know that what follows is she has to drink the waters of Sotah to prove her innocence. But if one witness comes along and says that he saw her actually commit adultery, then she is not allowed to drink the waters of Sotah. We believe the testimony of this one witness, and she is forever forbidden to her husband. There's no consequences. You need two Eidim and Hasra to give her Misa. But she loses her ksuba, and she is forever forbidden to her husband. They have to get divorced, even though there's no two witnesses that actually saw the act happening. In this case, the Torah believes one witness. So the Gemara asks, why does the Torah make an exception by Sotah and believe the testimony of a single witness? Says the Braisa. The reason is because there's a background over here. It didn't just come out of the blue. We know that he warned her. So if the husband warned her, obviously there was reason for a suspicion that something was wrong. And we know that she violated the husband's warning and she actually secluded herself in a private place with this man. And on top of that, we have a single witness that testifies that she actually became defiled. So we accept the testimony of the one witness, and we don't allow her to drink the waters of Sotah, and we insist that she gets divorced from her husband and loses her ksuba. So Rav Papa asked Abaye, you're telling me the reason the Torah believes the one witness by Sotah is because there's a background. If you look in the Psukim, you'll see that the words v'kinayis ishtay come after v'nistera v'hinitma. So it doesn't seem to work according to the way you're describing it. You're telling me that first there's a background of her being warned and violating the warning, and then we have the story of the one witness claiming that he saw her commit adultery. The order in the pasuk is the other way around. The kinayas ishta is written after v'nistera v'hinitma. Amar lei, so Abaye answered Rav Papa, va'avar ukvar avar. The meaning of the word va'avar is that ukvar avar, before this happened, before she secluded herself, and before she became defiled, before this all, there was already a warning. Back to Gemara, is that the case that wherever it says va'avar, it means ukvar avar already happened before? Elamayata, if that's the case, we know the story of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, who came to Moshe Rabbeinu when they asked for a nachla in Ever HaYarden. They wanted to be given the eastern part of the Jordan, the eastern bank of the Jordan, as their inheritance in Eretz Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, "You remind me of the Meraglim. You want to stay behind and you want to send everybody else to fight to conquer the west bank of Eretz Yisrael, to conquer Eretz Yisrael. You're going to weaken the determination of Yidden to conquer Eretz Yisrael." So they said, "No, that's not our intention at all. We are going to go ahead. We're going to settle the land of the eastern bank of the Jordan with our families. We'll put our wives and our children and our cattle and our sheep in the eastern part of the Jordan. And we're going to go ahead as scouts to conquer the west bank of the Jordan." So Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, if you'll keep your promise that you will go over lachem kol chalutz, you will go ahead as scouts to conquer the west bank of the Jordan, then you can have this land of Ever HaYarden as your inheritance. So the lashon in the pasuk is va'avar lachem kol chalutz. Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to them that you will go ahead as scouts to conquer the west bank of the Jordan. So hachanami amar lei va'avar elamayata, elamayata va'avar lachem kol chalutz hachanami. You want to tell me that when it says in the pasuk va'avar lachem kol chalutz, it also means kvar avar, that before this whole discussion you already had as scouts? We know that that's not the case. It means you're going to go ahead. Says the Gemara, Hasam over there, because it says in the pasuk, the land will be conquered before Hashem, and then you will return. So over there we have no choice. Over there it's clear that it's talking about the future. But over here where it says, if you think it means like the order of the pasuk, if you look in Argois Habach, there's a few extra words over here. That first, it says in the pasuk, that she was secluded and she became defiled. And then the warning came, basar tumo stira, after she already became defiled and after she secluded herself with this man. Then she got the warning, kinoi lamali. What's the point of the warning? After the effect. The warning should be given, obviously, before it happened, not after it happened. You know the famous story about a father that sent his son to buy a bottle of milk. And he told him, be very, very careful. Don't drop the bottle of milk and don't break it. Remember, be careful. Don't drop the bottle of milk. It's a glass bottle. It's going to break into a million pieces. Be careful. Hold on tight to it and don't break it. Then he calls over his son and he gives him a patch. So the son asks the father, why are you giving me a patch? I haven't broken it yet. So he said, what, should I wait until you break it and then give you a patch? What will the patch achieve? I gave you now that you shouldn't break it. So obviously the warning only makes sense before the effect. So if you think it's like the order of the pasuk, that first came the tumah and stira and then the warning, that wouldn't make any sense. So therefore over here, the avar must be nukvar avar, that before the tumah and stira there was already a warning. While in the pasuk, avar lachem kol chalutz, it has to be referring to the future. Tana dvei Rabbi Shmuel. Talmidim Rabbi Shmuel learned on a brayso. Ein adam mekane leishtei elam kei nichnas bei ruach. A man doesn't give a warning to his wife unless a spirit enters him. We'll soon discuss what type of a spirit. How do we know this? Shenemar, it says in the pasuk, a spirit of kina enters him, and therefore he warned his wife. So obviously some kind of a spirit entered him in order for him to warn his wife. What kind of a spirit are we talking about? The Chachamim say it means a spirit of impurity. In other words, it's not a good idea for a husband to warn his wife. They should find a better way to settle their differences. And Rav Ashi Amar Ruach Tar. Rav Ashi says, no, the spirit here is a spirit of purity. It's actually the appropriate way to deal with this matter is by him giving her a warning. It makes sense, like the opinion that says that it's a spirit of purity. The Tanya, because we learned in a brayso, V'kinei es ishtei reshus. Pasuk says, V'kinei es ishtei. The man warns his wife. Question is does the Torah give him the prerogative to warn his wife? He has the option of doing so. Or is the Torah instructing him to warn his wife? How do we learn Pshat and V'kinei es ishtei? So we have here Machlekes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. The kineis ishtay reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says the kineis ishtay is a prerogative, is something that the Torah gives him an option. If he chooses to, he may warn his wife. Rabbi Akiva says no, it's an obligation. And if a husband sees his wife behaving in a way which is inappropriate, he has an obligation to warn her. So if you agree that the ruach that we're speaking about is a ruach tara, spirit of purity, shapit, then it makes sense that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva should be arguing whether this act in accordance with this ruach tara is optional or obligatory. Eli amrit ruach tumah, but if you say that the ruach that the pasuk is speaking about is a ruach of impurity, could you have a discussion whether it's optional or obligatory for a person to bring a spirit of impurity into his life, into his soul? Obviously, the Torah wouldn't be encouraging a person to do something which comes from a spirit of impurity. So therefore, we accept the opinion that says that the ruach that we're speaking about over here is a ruach tahara. Gufa. The word gufa is used in the Gemara after we quote a Tanaic statement, a Braisa or a Mishnah, by the way, for other purposes. Then sometimes the Gemara will stop and say, Gufa, let's stop for a minute and let's examine the Braisa or the Mishnah itself for its own purpose. So we can understand that Mishnah which we just quoted, or that Braisa which we just quoted for other purposes, let's try and delve into it and understand it properly for its own sake. So Gufa, let's look now at the Braisa itself that we just quoted, the Machlekes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, whether the kineis ishtay is optional or obligatory. Let's delve into it and understand it properly. Now this is actually part of a larger Braisa. So the Braisa starts the kineis ishtay. This is what we learned before. Pasuk says the kineis ishtay, the man warns his wife. Reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel holds that it's an option that he has to warn his wife. Rabbi Akiva holds it's an obligation. And similar machlekes we have on the pasuk lo yitam. Everybody knows that a kohen is not allowed to come into contact with a dead body. He's not allowed to make himself tamei in contact with the dead. However, there's an exception. And the exception is if a close relative passes away, his father, his mother, his brother, under certain circumstances, his sister, or his son or his daughter, Rahman al-Islam, is only wissen from them. So then the kohen may make himself tamei. So the question is, what does the Torah mean when it says lo yitam? Reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says it means that he has permission to make himself tamei. Rabbi Akiva Eimer Chayva. Rabbi Akiva says not just permission to make himself tamei, but he actually has an obligation to make himself tamei. He has an obligation to become closely involved in the burial of his relative to the point where he becomes tamei. Similar machlekes we have by another pasuk. It says La'olam b'hem ta'avaydu. If you have an Evet Knaini, a Canaanite servant, so by a Jewish servant, an Evet Ivri, we know there's a mitzvah to free him after 6 years. 6 years, 6 years he should work, and the 7th year he goes free. However, if he's an Evet Knaini, then the Torah says there's no mitzvah to free him. You can work with him forever. So the question is it an option to keep working with him forever, or is it an obligation to work with him forever, and it's actually forbidden to free him? So this we have a machlekes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. And the pasuk lo'olam b'hem ta'avaydu, reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says it's reshus, it's optional. Rabbi Akiva Eimer Chayva. Rabbi Akiva says it's an obligation. So we have in 3 cases the machlekes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva if something the Torah tells us to do is optional or obligatory. Amar le Rav Papa l'Abaye. So Rav Papa asked Abaye a question. Amri lo Rav Mesharshi l'Rava. Some say Rav Mesharshi asked this question to Rava. Perhaps we should suggest that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva have this machlekes throughout the entire Torah. It's not just these 3 specific psukim that they're arguing about. Perhaps they're arguing about everything written in the Torah. Is it the Torah recommending it as an option, or is the Torah telling this to us as an obligation? Rabbi Shmuel will always say that everything that we can interpret to be optional, we should interpret to be optional. And Rabbi Akiva will always, whenever we have an option of saying that it's obligatory, Rabbi Akiva will lean towards saying it's obligatory. Amar le, so he answered him. That is, Abaye answered Rav Papa, or Rava answered Rav Mesharshi. In these 3 instances, there's a specific reason why we have this argument, because we're arguing about the interpretation of the psukim. These specific psukim, and we'll explain why. The kineis ishtei reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva Eimer Chayva. We have the machlekes to Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva if giving the warning to the suspected adulteress is optional or obligatory. My time is Rabbi Shmuel. So why does Rabbi Shmuel hold that it's optional? Sabar la kahaytan. He holds like the following Tanya. The Tanya we learned in the Brayso. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Eimer. Lezer ben Yaakov says, "Klapi she'amra Torah le'sisnas achicha bilpavecha." Because the Torah says as a general rule, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. In other words, it's forbidden to have a negative feeling towards another Jew. Yachol kegainzu. So I would have thought that since the Torah tells us to be accepting and loving and never have a negative feeling towards another Jew, so if a husband sees his wife behaving inappropriately, he should ignore it. He shouldn't react, because you have to take everything with a positive attitude and not in any way. So I might think that that would include this case as well. Therefore, the Torah tells us, no, in these circumstances you have to act. You have a spirit of kina should pass over him, and he should warn his wife. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel is saying, since this involves transgressing the isur of leisisnas achicha bilvavecha, so the Torah has to tell us that it's permissible in this case to make an exception and give that warning. However, Rabbi Akiva will hold Rabbi Akiva. So how does Rabbi Akiva deal with this? Akiva will say, the word v'kina yasishte is mentioned twice in the Torah. Once to tell us that it's permissible, and once to tell us that it's an obligation. So if it's mentioned twice in the Torah, so surely Rabbi Shmuel should agree with Rabbi Akiva that it's obligatory. Says the Gemara, I did the boy lemichta v'hinitma. Since the Torah wants to say v'hinitma v'hilaynitma, the Torah wants to say that there's two possibilities here. One possibility was that she secluded herself with this man and she became defiled. There's also a possibility that she secluded herself with this man and she did not become defiled. We don't really know. So since the Torah wants to say both v'hinitma v'hilaynitma, therefore the Torah repeats the words v'kineis ishtay v'hinitma, or avar olav ruach kina v'kineis ishtay v'hilaynitma. So in order to say v'hinitma v'hilaynitma, the Torah repeats v'kineis ishtay, but not to tell us a special halacha that it's an obligation. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel continues to hold that it's optional, and Rabbi Akiva says it's an obligation. And this is l'chdetana devei Rabbi Shmuel. This fits with another brayso that the Talmidim of Rabbi Shmuel learned. The Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel called parsha shenemra of nishnis. Like nishnis olav shvil davar shenis chadish ba. The Talmidim of Rabbi Shmuel learned in a brayso that whenever the Torah repeats something, it's sometimes an entire parsha is repeated for one thing that changes, for one thing, for one difference that is introduced. So over here also, the Torah will repeat the words v'kineis ishtay only to add to v'hinitma also the option of v'hilaynitma. Continuing on, lo yitam. The pasuk says that a kohen may make himself tamei to a relative. Reshus divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So we learned before, Rabbi Shmuel says it is optional. The kohen may make himself tamei; he doesn't have to. Rabbi Akiva says it's an obligation; he has to. My time with Rabbi Shmuel. What's the reason of Rabbi Shmuel? Why does Rabbi Shmuel hold that it's only an option? Since a previous pasuk tells us, speak to the Kohen and the sons of Aaron and tell them that they may not defile themselves to a dead body. It's therefore the Torah has to write lo yitama to tell us there's an exception by a relative. This prohibition does not apply, and a Kohen may defile himself when a close relative passes away. But it doesn't mean that he has to. Rabbi Akiva. So what will Rabbi Akiva respond to this? Rabbi Akiva will say, the fact that a Kohen may defile himself to a relative, that we know already from the words, the Torah says, only except by a relative. Lo yitama lamali. Why does the Torah emphasize lo yitama to her? He should defile himself. L'chayva, to make it an obligation. So Rabbi Shmuel. So what would Rabbi Shmuel respond to that? It's quite clear from the pasuk that there's a double lashon, ki'im l'sha'edai and lo yitama. So it would seem that it's obligatory. Why does Rabbi Shmuel maintain it's optional? Says the Gemara, lo mitama ve'ein mitama le'vereh. Rabbi Shmuel says from the pasuk lo yitama we learn that he can only defile himself to her. Says to his sister when she passes away, a sister who was never married. When she passes away, he can defile herself to her, but not to her organs. Meaning that if, God forbid, a person's organ was removed during their lifetime, then that organ has a din of tumah, and the kohen may not defile himself to a relative's organs. It also, I believe, means that if a person's body was chas v'shalom, it was cut up and it's not intact, then also the option or the heter of being metame does not apply. Therefore, in a case where an autopsy is made on a relative of a kohen, a shaila has to be asked if the dinim of being metame himself to a relative apply even when the body is not intact. And these are halacha shaylas shenegaya to all that can possibly be shaylas. So if the pasuk lo yitama is learned that the heter of being metame to a kohen's relative is only for when the body is intact, but not to organs of the body. So Rabbi Akiva says, if that's the case, it could have just said law. Law, we would learn from law. Yitama lamali. Why does the pasuk say, in addition to the word law, also the word yitama? Shmami no, it comes to teach us that it's not just an option, but it's actually an obligation. Rabbi Yishmael, so what would Rabbi Yishmael respond to that? Rabbi Yishmael say, I did the cause of law, cause of nami yitama. Since the pasuk has to say the word law to teach us the din of law, so it adds the word yitama as well. And this goes along with what the Talmidim of Rabbi Yishmael learned in Rabbi Isa. The Tanat of Rabbi Yishmael called Parsha Shenem of Nishnis, Nishnis Olav Shel Davar Chadishba. Sometimes we find an entire parsha repeated in the Torah to teach us one new thing. Similarly, the words La Yitama, both words are put in to teach us the one halacha of La v'Lo Leivareh. La'olam b'em tavedu reshus divrei Rabbi Yishmael. The pasuk La'olam b'em tavedu that when Evet Knaini you can work forever. Rabbi Yishmael says it's optional. You don't have to free him after 6 years like you do by an Evet Ivri. You may work with him forever. Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's an obligation to work with the Evet Knaini forever. My time at Rabbi Yishmael. What's the reason that Rabbi Yishmael says that it's an option? Because since it says in the pasuk that when you enter into Eretz Canaan and you have to completely destroy the people that live there, the Knainim, and you shouldn't let anybody live, so we need the pasuk Lo'olam b'em tavedu to make an exception. What's the exception? So what happens if you have a non-Knaini, an immigrant, a person that comes from another nation, and he came to Canaan, and he lived with a Canaanite woman, and she bore to him a child. And generally the halacha is that by Goyim, the lineage of the child goes according to the father. So therefore, since the child, although his mother is a Knainis, his father is not non-Knaini. So how do we know that you're allowed to buy him as a servant? You don't have to kill him. So that's what the pasuk Lo'olam b'em tavedu comes to teach us, that even though generally when you come into the land of Canaan, you have an obligation to kill all the inhabitants of the land. But in this case, where the father is a non-Knaini, you're allowed to keep him as a servant, and you don't have to kill him. The Tanya, because we learned in Rabbi Isa, how do we know that if a member of another nation lives with a Canaanite woman, and they have a son together, that you're allowed to buy this child as your servant, this offspring of this union as a servant? Talmud Lamar, the pasuk tells you, and also from the children of the residents that are dwelling with you, from them you may buy. So you might think that the same is true the other way around. That if a Canaanite man lived with a non-Canaanite woman and they had a child together, that you would be allowed to buy him as a slave and not kill him. Talmud Leimar that were born in your land. Only those that were born in your land, implying that the mother is a Canaanite, but not from those that are sojourning in your land, meaning that if the father is a Canaanite and the mother is a non-Canaanite, the child is considered a Knaini, and you don't have any heter to keep him as a servant. So Rabbi Yishmael is basically saying, since we have an obligation to kill all the people of Canaan, so we need to have a pasuk to permit us to keep this individual as a slave. That it's permissible. Rabbi Akiva. So what would Rabbi Akiva respond to that? Akiva will say, the fact that it's permissible to buy as a servant the offspring of a union where the mother is a Canaanite and the father is a non-Canaanite, that I already know from the pasuk mehem tiknu, from them you may buy. Why do I need the extra words? Forever you may work with them. To tell me that it's an obligation to work with them forever. Rabbi Shmuel will respond to that and he'll say, the reason that we need the pasuk L'olam Bahem Tavedu is Bahem V'lei Ba'achechem, that you can only work forever with them, but not with your brethren. As we said before, if you have an Eved Ivri, you have to free him after 6 years, and you cannot keep him forever. Rabbi Akiva. So what would Rabbi Akiva respond to that? How could you learn from the pasuk L'olam Tavedu? That is an obligation when the word Bahem is used to teach you Bahem V'lei Ba'achechem. And for the Gemara, Ba'achechem Misei for the Krona. The fact that you're not allowed to work with your brother forever, that we learn from the end of the pasuk, where it says clearly in the pasuk, that your brothers, the sons of Israel, one man with his brother, you should not work with him, backbreaking work. So we have it clear that you cannot treat a Jewish servant as you would treat a Canaanite servant. So we don't need the pasuk to tell me because the din of we already learned from. We already learned from the pasuk B'achechem b'nei Yisrael yishbachim le'sirta be'befarach. Rabbi Shmuel. So what would Rabbi Shmuel respond to that? Why does he still insist that it's only an option? Says Rabbi Shmuel, since it says B'achechem b'nei Yisrael yishbachim le'sirta be'befarach, it also says L'olam Bahem Tavedu, only them and not Yidden. The Tanad Rabbi Shmuel, like the Talmidim of Rabbi Shmuel learned, the Tanad Rabbi Shmuel called Parsha Shenemar of Nishnis, any parsha which is repeated in the Torah. The entire parsha could be repeated for one new thing that we learn from this parsha. So the whole pasuk is put in for the one new halacha that we learn, that Bahem V'lei Ba'achechem. Amar Rav Chisda, new subject. Amar Rav Chisda said, Snusa bebeisa ki karyu l'shumshum. If there's adultery in the home, it destroys the home like worms destroy sesame. Yamar Rav Chisda, another thing Rav Chisda said, took for the base if there's anger in a home, kikarya l'shum shema. It's also like worms for sesame. Both these statements, that adultery in a home destroys the home, and that anger in a home destroys the home, is primarily referring to if the woman has any of these tendencies. But if the man has these tendencies, we're not suggesting that men should commit adultery, we're not suggesting that men should get angry, but as far as the destruction of the fabric of the home, the woman's behavior has a much stronger, she's the akeres habayis, she sets the tone for the home. So her behavior has a much stronger effect on the home than the husband's behavior. So when Rav Chisda said, he was referring primarily to the woman and not to the man. The Amar Rav Chisda, another thing Rav Chisda said, originally, before the Jewish people sinned, the Shekhinah was dwelling with every single individual. Shenamar, as it says in the pasuk, for Hashem your God is walking amongst your camp, in the midst of your camp. Even Shechatu, once they sinned, the Shekhinah departed from them. Shenamar, as it says in the pasuk, he sees with you something which is inappropriate, he will turn away from you. Even though originally the Shekhinah was with every single Yid, nevertheless, as a result of their sin, it caused the Shekhinah to depart. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Yonasan. Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rav Yonasan, Kol ha'eisa mitzvah achas be'elam hazeh, person who performs one mitzvah in this world, mikatmatu v'hilechas lefanav be'elam haba. That mitzvah goes ahead of him in the world to come. Shenemar v'holach lefanecha tzidkach, your righteousness will walk before you. People will know my story. Tell it anyway, that my grandfather, Alav Hashalom Rabbi Yechanan, was instructed by the Rebbe to give shiurim to elderly people, like the Tiferes Keinim that the Rebbe instituted many years later. So he had a shir with elderly people, and many of them were hard of hearing. He himself was a bit hard of hearing. And there was one participant in the shir that was deaf like a wall. He couldn't hear anything. And he insisted on sitting in the first spot in the shir. Yes, they didn't have the Zoom idea where everybody could be first spot. He insisted on sitting right next to the Maggid Shir. So the other elderly people that had a hard time hearing, they said to him, why do you have to sit first? You don't hear anything anyway. Let somebody else who is hard of hearing sit first. At least they'll be able to hear. So he answered, Azayvi mir sitzen da, azayvel mir sitzen dort. The way we're sitting over here around the table, that's the way we're going to sit over there in the other world around the table. Und dorten will ich hin. And over there, I'm going to hear perfectly. So I'm not giving up my spot. So the Gemara says, if a person does a mitzvah in this world, that mitzvah goes ahead of him in Eilam Haba. The person does an Aveda in this world, it sticks to him, it clings to him, and walks before him to the day of judgment. Abelezer says, if a person does an Aveda in this world, the Aveda is tied to him like a dog. Shanemar, as it says by Yosef HaTzadik, he didn't listen to her, to lie next to her, to be with her. So what's the double lashon lishkav etzla liyas ima? So the Gemara says lishkav etzla ba'elam hazeh liyas ima lo'elam haba. Yosef HaTzadik realized that you can't separate the two. If he will lie next to her in this world, then he will be with her in the world to come. He'll have to schlep her along with him in Eilam Haba, and for that he understood as nishkadai. Non-husam. So we're back to the subject that we discussed yesterday about whether we believe the testimony of one witness. So non-husam. We learned in a Mishnah in the further Perek, shahaya bedin. Really, if we used logic, we would come up with the following argument. Uma edus harishena she'eino israsa yisur olam eino miskayemes b'pachas mishnayim. If the testimony that she defied the husband's warning, and she secluded herself with this man that she was warned not to seclude herself. If this testimony, you need a minimum of 2 witnesses in order for this testimony to be considered valid. So the ultimate testimony that she actually committed adultery, which is going to make her forbidden to her husband forever, surely should need 2 witnesses. In other words, if there are witnesses that she secluded herself with this man, but we don't know what happened when she secluded herself with this man, then the maximum that's going to do, it can make her drink the waters of Sota, and either the waters of Sota will prove her innocence, and then she'll be allowed to go back to her husband, or the waters of Sota will do their job. But if there are witnesses if there's one witness that says that she was actually defiled, that she actually committed adultery, then she's forever forbidden to her husband. So logic would argue that if the testimony, the testimony of Stira, which does not make her usher forever, because she can always drink the waters of Sota and prove her innocence. And nevertheless, over there we said you need 2 witnesses. So the testimony that she committed adultery, which is going to make her usher forever, and the waters of Sota won't help anymore for her, surely you should need 2 witnesses. So we have the pasuk that tells ve'ed eimba, kol sheyeshba. Any minimal amount of testimony is sufficient to achieve this prohibition, as a result of the fact that we have even one witness that saw her being defiled. Now says the Gemara, so now you can work the Kal V'chemer backwards. So if the testimony that she was defiled, that she actually committed adultery, which makes her forbidden forever to her husband, it's sufficient 1 witness. So the first testimony, the testimony that says that she defied the husband's warning and secluded herself with this man, which does not make her forbidden forever, because she can always drink the waters of Sota and prove her innocence, should surely be sufficient 1 witness. So the pasuk says, that he found in her, this is a pasuk in Kiseitze by the din of a get, he found in her a inappropriate manner. Another pasuk says, that by the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, a matter should be established. So the Torah uses the word davar over here and davar over here. So we have a gzeir and shava. Ma davar ha'amar lahalon al pishnayim edim. Just like the word davar, al pishnayim edim, al pishleisha edim yakum davar, it has to be a minimum of 2 witnesses. Afkan al pishnayim over here also, kimatza ba'ervas davar, there must be a minimum of 2 witnesses. So therefore, even though logic would say that 1 witness should be sufficient, we have a Kal V'chemer, we have a pasuk that insists that you need 2 witnesses by edus of Stira. The fact that by Stira you need 2 witnesses, we learn from Kimatza ba'ervas davar from Gzeir Shava. Mi ba nafke, we learn it from the word ba. The eid ein ba. We learned this yesterday. Ba v'lei b'kinoi, ba v'lei b'stira. That an eid echad is only good for tumah. An eid echad is only good if he himself says that I saw her being defiled, I saw her committing adultery. But not if he says that I saw the husband give her a warning, or if he says I saw her defy the husband's warning and seclude herself with this man. Because in those two cases, we need two witnesses. So mibanafti, babalei bekini, babalei bestinim abayim. And for the Gemara, hachin amikam. That's exactly what the Mishnah means. Talmud leimar, babalei bekini, babalei bestinim. Why is 1 8 not enough by kinui and stira? Because the pasuk says ve'ed aim ba, and from the pasuk ba we derive babalei bekini, babalei bestinim. Tuma ba'alma b'lei kinui b'lei stira le'mehemen echad minah. How do we know that in an ordinary case where there was no warning and there was no violation of the warning, a single witness comes along out of the blue and says he saw this woman commit adultery? How do we know that in that case we don't accept his testimony? So for that, the Mishnah says, by the case where a man suspects that his wife committed adultery, the Torah says, and by Dine Maminus it says, so we have Exer Shabbat Davar Davar, Ma Davar Ha'amar Lahal and Edim Shnayim, just like by Dine Maminus, for cases of monetary, there has to be two witnesses. Afkan Edim Shnayim, over here also, if there was no Kino Yastira preceding this testimony, that only two witnesses will be accepted to testify that this woman committed adultery. But anything less than two witnesses would not be accepted. So this concludes our shir in Daf Gimel of Soita. And Bezos Hashem, tomorrow morning at 11:45, everyone is welcome to join us for the next block. Everybody, a wonderful day, a good mayid, and it should be Emes Manche Ruseinu, as we learned this morning in the Maimer, Ki Meitzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim Arenan Niflois. We're celebrating Yitzias Mitzrayim now. We're celebrating the Yom Tov of Yitzias Mitzrayim. So this should lead us directly into the real Yom Tov of the Emes Manche Ruseinu, true Chayrus through Mashiach Tzidkenu, and Geula Amitis V'Ashleima, take it from Yad Mamash, especially since today is a special day. It's Chai Nissen, which is the birthday of the Rebbe's father, Reb Levi Yitzchak, and also the anniversary of the Rebbe's bris. The Rebbe was born on Yud Aleph Nissen, which we celebrated last Sunday. And when a baby is born on Sunday, bris is the next Sunday. So Chai Nissen, the anniversary of the Rebbe's bris.